Hello, so I'm going to be taking time to talk about Captain Joel Trimble before our staff ride up to Whitebird. He was pretty important in this battle and made some major decisions and had a lot going on before he even got to here, which got him his rank of captain. All right, so TLOs and ELOs, so we're going to describe and understand who Captain Joel Trimble was and his background to understand the choices that he made as a captain. I'll describe and we'll understand the company he led at the Battle of Whitebird. I'll describe and understand the mission he led at Whitebird, describe and understand the retreat from the mission, and then did he actually make the right call? All right, so a little background on Captain Joel Trimble. So he's considered, okay, sorry, my dogs were squeaking their toys. Okay, he is considered a soldier of the Oregon frontier. He actually preferred to live in the Wild West. He retired as a major, actually. He did get promoted one more time, and he retired in Berkeley, California. For 30 years, he was a soldier in the frontiers of Oregon, Idaho, and Washington, which is why they called him a soldier of the Oregon frontier. The only other places he fought was, of course, down south during the Civil War, and he was a major player in the Civil War as well, which I will go over here shortly. He was born in Philadelphia, but soon moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. So continuing on, he was in college, which is where he gets his background to actually be an officer, but he decided that college was stupid and he should go to California to hunt for gold, which of course a lot of people did back then, and of course that was the most brilliant choice anyone could make. It did not go well. On his trip there, he took 6 men with him. On the way, 2 got cholera, and then the other 2 freaked out, and by the time everything was said and done, he was the only person left. But even though all that happened, he was just fascinated with Western lifestyle. He loved that Wild West kind of atmosphere, going through all these old mining towns, and he really wanted to embrace all of that. So even though he was completely broke and alone, he walked 60 miles to Leavenworth and worked as a herder with the 1st Rifle Regiment. This regiment was about to make its way out to Oregon, so this is where he actually makes it out to the west. After his trip to Oregon, 2 years later, he joined Major Kearney and set out for California. So this picture is actually pretty cool. It's where the Rogue River War took place. At this point, Captain Joe Trimble was not a captain at all. In fact, he wasn't even enlisted. He was just a volunteer with Major Kearney. During this battle, he watched one of his captains get killed. And even though he saw that and was injured himself, he was not deterred from fighting. And as soon as he was old enough, he enlisted. And when he did enlist, he joined the 1st U.S. Dragoons. So then, when the Civil War broke out, he re-enlisted in the 2nd Dragoons and headed out for Williamsburg. All right, so then Williamsburg was his actual first fight within the Civil War. He realized that this was very different from fighting Indians. When we went through our history unit, we learned that fighting Indians was different because they were elusive and they actually had some tactical skill versus fighting the Union versus the South during the Civil War. It was very stand in a line and just shoot at each other. So he kind of struggled for a while figuring out the difference between fighting Indians and the Civil War. But because of all of his background, he was actually very successful and helpful during the war. He was wounded at Malvern Hill and recovered quickly. And then he was wounded again at Gettysburg, but once again recovered quickly because he just wanted to be back in the fight. It was what he wanted to be doing with his life. So because he recovered so quickly, he was able to join Sheridan down in the Shenandoah Valley. We all know what happened down there. He fought at Cedar Creek with General Sheridan, and he was actually personally thanked by the general for his daring service. And once again, that all comes back to his training of fighting Indians in the wild, wild West. So I think that's where he gets a lot of his background, as it comes from this just crazy, elusive fighting in the hills and in the forest, and he was able to apply that in the Civil War. So after the Civil War, he headed off to Texas to help halt French aggression in Mexico. And then still continuing on, he was ordered back to Oregon, which actually made him pretty happy. And the Modoc War began. And that was a pretty important war in Oregon. He was actually the one that captured Captain Jack, who was the leader of that Indian tribe, and that's his picture right there. And then after that war, hearing of the Nez Perce taking revenge on settlers and killing them, Trimble headed out for Whitebird. I really liked this quote by Trimble. He spoke this about the Nez Perce. So no more daring feat of prowess was performed by skirmishers at any period of the Civil War. I think we talked about this a lot with Major McDaniel when we were talking about D-Day, and we were talking about understanding the enemy and all of the background and planning that went into D-Day to understand the Germans so that we could hopefully be as successful as we possibly could. And even though Trimble and Perry lost at Whitebird, Trimble was able to recognize that the Nez Perce were really good at what they did, and they were very successful skirmishers, and because of their background and training, they were able to defeat the American soldiers like it was no big deal. And I think it's a lot for someone to say and realize that another group is so much better than you. And I think you can learn a lot from that. So going into the battle at Whitebird, there were some serious issues. The men had significantly less combat experience than any of the men stationed in the Great Plains fighting other Indian bands. There's only 54 men in the company, which was average strength back then. And this company was short one of the 2 lieutenants assigned to the company, and they lacked authorized sergeants. The officers and the NCOs had experience, but the enlisted men did not. Most of them were older, between their 30s and 40s. They lacked training on riding and shooting. They were really just made for long campaigns of walking and eating and doing not much more than that. And they weren't really prepared to see combat. So, on the other side, the Nez Perce, they were extremely skilled horsemen. I mean, they were known for their Appaloosa horses that were so well trained for war. These horses could literally care less. They would just stand there and eat grass while their trained rider would fight and use them as like a rest for their rifle. The other thing that the Nez Perce had is they knew economy. They didn't have a lot of ammunition. They had to spare what they had, and so they were expert marksmen because they couldn't waste a bunch of bullets hoping they'd hit their target because they didn't have bullets. Also, they understood the terrain and they knew when to dismount and take cover, and I think that's a big difference between the Nez Perce and the soldiers that fought at Whitebird. The U.S. soldiers just sat there on their horses, and the Nez Perce knew when to get off their horse and take cover in the brush. Plus, they were really angry. Their reservation had been shrunk by 90%, and many of them refused to sign the treaty that would make that acceptable. So it all started on June 15th and June 16th. Captain Trimble with Captain Perry left Fort Lapwai to investigate reports on the Nez Perce. They were also escorting Nez Perce onto the reservation. 11 civilian volunteers joined, and they realized that the Nez Perce had left for Whitebird. And they continued to press on because there were settlers in Grangeville and they didn't want to take over in Grangeville. But after traveling for 70 miles in 2 days, the men were not really ready to immediately hop into a battle. They were exhausted. The horses were exhausted. So right in the morning, there was a peace parley. The Indian scouts actually did see them coming into town, and they were able to alert more than 70 warriors immediately before the soldiers even hit the hill. And they sent scouts to parallel the route they expected the soldiers to take, which is pretty smart. I mean, before the battle even starts, they're set up for success. And since it was spring, there was lots of waist-high grass, kind of like South Dakota, where we were last summer. And they were all covered and nobody knew where they were there. And then for some weird reason, one of the volunteers, even though they weren't supposed to shoot, fired on the peace party. So war breaks out. So I'm going to specifically talk about Trimble's company, which is Company Hotel. So upon hearing the shots, Captain Trimble ordered his men to assume the ridge on the far right of Captain Perry's line. He kept his men mounted in anticipation of an order to charge, which is great in theory, but if you're mounted on a horse, you have no cover. The Nez Perce saw them and immediately maneuvered around the outside of the company, leading. And as the Nez Perce were riding by, they knew how to stay on their horses but lean completely over so that no one could really shoot at them. And they almost used their ponies as kind of a block from the soldier's rifle. And they were able to perform this flanking movement. This flanking movement caused many of Trimble's soldiers to panic. Remember, they don't have any training, really. So they panicked and they bunched up in this really tight group right behind his company. And Captain Trimble was wanting to protect his flank. So he sent First Sergeant McCarthy and 6 men to hold a high point on a rocky outcropping. And that was actually successful of Trimble. He knew he had to protect his flank. He knew he had to protect them because they were protecting Captain Perry's side. And First Sergeant McCarthy was actually successful at keeping the Indians at bay for a while. And then while Sergeant McCarthy was doing this, Captain Trimble was able to return to the main line to confer with Captain Perry and decide what they were actually going to do. So this is where some controversy comes into play. Captain Trimble suggested that the soldiers charge towards the village to gain the initiative once again. The mission was to gain the village, secure the Nez Perce tribe, and hopefully push them onto their reservation. Well, they'd pretty much lost all of that when the Nez Perce proved to be stronger warriors. Captain Perry disagreed. He said that that was absolutely crazy, and the only way to avoid catastrophe and not have everyone completely wiped out was to retreat. And Captain Perry's choice overruled Captain Trimble, and they did decide to retreat. Captain Trimble was to move his company to the rear to find a defensible position, which is rather smart since at this point they are all still just sitting on their horses. So I guess it's kind of important to think about this. Who held a better understanding of the situation? Was it Trimble or Perry? I think Perry looked at it from the side of, how do I keep all of my men safe and alive? Whereas Trimble looked at it from all of his background, fighting Indians, fighting in the Civil War, and said, you know, if we really want to be successful in our mission, we need to charge. So I don't think either man was incorrect. I think they both had good ideas, but for the sake of keeping everyone safe and alive, Perry's idea was obviously the better choice. Why was it smart for Trimble to take the high ground to the right? Obviously, so that he could provide support. And then the weaknesses of his position, he was able to be flanked on the right side, and the fact that his men weren't strong enough to hold their own line really led to some severe issues. But You guys can